even with my big mouth.
Now, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Very good, thank you. I won't speak that loudly. Sean Robinson, I'm the Associate Director of the Center for Business and Information Technologies, as well as the Site Director for the Center for Visual and Decision Informatics at the University of Louisiana Lafayette. So that's a lot of blah, blah, blah to say. I help run 2 research centers that are computer science and big data based. Thank you so much for coming today. It's going to be a great day in terms of plenary sessions, some phenomenal speakers. And I was talking to Bryan, and I said, well, how do you want me to introduce you? What do you want me to do? And it was a great conversation of just say, I'm Bryan, and I'm here to speak to you. I'm like, okay, well, we can do that. So, you don't want to hear from me, you want to hear from him. So without much further ado, Chief Technology Officer of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Bryan Sivak. Thank you.
As you guys can tell, I'm sort of an atypical government employee. I'm not the guy that walks around with bodyguards and lots of entourages, unless you count Zach. So, first of all, good morning, everybody. I gotta tell you, I love Lafayette. I got off the airplane yesterday in a weird sort of way. I felt like I was back home. I've only been here once, and I still felt like I was back home. You guys are, I'm serious. And it's not just because I was conferred upon, the title of honorary occasion was conferred upon me last year when I was here, which I do actually take very seriously. But it really, there's just a spirit here that I totally identify with. It's just, this like can-do kind of spirit that I love. So I will keep coming back here, I promise, as long as you guys will keep having me. So, without further ado, I am Bryan Sivak. I am the Chief Technology Officer and also the Entrepreneur in Residence. I have 2 titles at the Department of Health and Human Services. And in that capacity, I run an organization called the Idea Lab. This is sort of a new thing that we set up. The goal of the Idea Lab is very, very simple: to create a more modern, or actually not more, to create a modern and effective government. But before I get into the details of what that actually means, I want to give you guys a sense of the scope of what we're actually doing at the Department of Health and Human Services. So this is, in a lot of ways, what the department looks like. There are a bunch of these, what we call operating divisions, some of which you've probably heard of: the National Institute of Health, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, the Food and Drug Administration. Some you probably haven't heard of, such as ARC, the Administration for Healthcare Quality and Research, and a whole bunch of other ones. And what's interesting is that HHS doesn't really operate as one unit. It operates as 11 sort of very siloed. Sometimes they come together to do things together. They do work on a lot of the same stuff, but very, very frequently, it's just a very siloed operation. In fact, almost all of these entities have very specific, individual, unique line item funding from Congress. Okay, so that makes it very difficult to actually kind of corral and control. Now, let's go one level deeper. Let's just look at NIH. So most of these organizations from there, each one of these operating divisions has any number, or can be organized into any number of sort of other large entities. Centers, offices, branches. In the case of NIH, these are institutes. Okay, some of these institutes you might have heard of: the National Cancer Institute, the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, places like that. In NIH, there are a total of 27 of these, and each one of these, in turn, operates in a very siloed fashion. Okay, the National Cancer Institute is a very, very powerful entity, and they kind of do their own. Now, because I'm a little bit of a masochist, and because I was getting a little bit of a kick watching my guy Steven bang his head against the wall when he was putting the slide together, I asked him to go one level deeper. That's the National Cancer Institute, which, as you can see, has yet another 28 divisions, offices, bureaus, what have you. This is fractal-like in its operation, right? You can keep going down levels. I could probably go down another 4 levels in each one of these. And this is the scope of the problem that we're dealing with. And by the way, I just want to point one thing out. Look at how many acronyms are on this thing, right? I mean, government is a bizarre place. So the question to me becomes, if you're trying to create a modern and effective government, how do you take such a siloed, command and control oriented, hierarchical, risk adverse, red tape-filled operation and turn it into something that is much more modern, much more flexible, much more risk-aware, much more able to actually do interesting things to try to move the ball forward. That's where the idea lies. And that is the genesis of this entity. Now, how do we do it? In the Idea Lab, we have 3 core beliefs. Number 1, that anybody inside the department or outside the department has the potential to positively impact the health or well-being of any American. And actually, we operate around the world, so any individual around the world. But number 2, that people are much more powerful when working together. We have a lot of people at HHS who are all kind of working on the same thing. And if we can put them together and leverage their sort of individual efforts on a collective basis, we can do great things. And then third, and for me this is probably the most important one in government, there is a solution to every problem. So anytime you propose something in government, there are 1,000 people that are going to try to tell you no, right? And their answers are going to be, or their reasons are going to be sometimes okay, and most of the time not really there. But I have yet to find a problem that I haven't been able to solve with creative thinking. And that is a key thing to remember. Now, in the best government tradition, because we are part of the government, the Idea Lab itself has to be an acronym. They probably wouldn't let anything be created if it didn't have an acronym. So, it stands for 4 things. Innovation is number 1. Now I tend to, some of you have heard me say this before, I really don't like the word innovation. I don't like it because it's overused. I don't like it because it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Every single organization in the world likes to talk about how innovative they are, and so I think in that sort of context it loses its meaning. But we've decided to define it. And our definition of innovation is that it is a direct result of the freedom to experiment. If I can teach you how to experiment, if I can teach you the scientific method, if I can teach you to develop a hypothesis, run that hypothesis through some tests, generate some metrics, and then use those metrics to fuel future iterations of those tests, we believe that this thing called innovation will result. And it could be continuous innovation. It could just be make a process that already exists better. But it could also be a disruptive. It could be something where somebody has an idea about trying something that's never been done before. And we can give them the freedom and teach them the methodologies about how to do these things. And all of a sudden, out of the other side of this process comes a brand new, right? And in government, it's difficult to do, but if we can do that, I think we can change the game. D stands for design. How many of you guys have visited a government website and thought, man, that kind of sucks from a design perspective, right? If you look across the universe of the online universe these days, right, and actually even the offline universe in many cases, look at the iPhone in your pocket or any product that Apple basically ever produced, you'll see that there's a great deal of thought put into the user, a great deal of thought put into the design. And there's a reason for that. Devices, websites, applications, things that are well designed are fun to use, right? You're much more able to get ideas across and much more compelling. And I think we forget about that in government, right? We say, oh well, the design is sort of a nice to have instead of a need to have. But you know what? If we actually want to communicate our ideas effectively, think about it. That's a lot of what government does in communicating ideas. We need to think about the user experience. We need to think about it. So design, I think design is incredibly important. The E stands for entrepreneurship. The idea of entrepreneurship in government is a little bit sort of, there's a little bit of tension there, a little bit of an opposition. But it turns out that among the 90,000 people that work for HHS, there are a whole bunch of people that have this spirit and drive within them. It just needs to be activated. We need to find them. We need to teach them how they can actually sort of activate this feeling within them, this idea within them, and then lead them down a path where they can actually explore it a little bit, see if they are that kind of person. And so a lot of what we do is really focus on finding these people and helping them understand their inner entrepreneur, letting that inner entrepreneur out and helping them to do new and interesting things. And finally, the A stands for action. I have a quote framed in my office, one of my favorite quotes of all time by a guy named Herb Kelleher, who is the founder and ex-CEO of Southwest Airlines. Somebody asked him once what Southwest's strategic plan. You looked at this person and said, we have a strategic plan called doing. And I love that quote, right? Because it's absolutely right. You can talk all you want, and believe me, government's great at talking about a whole bunch of different things, but until you actually sit down and try something, experiment with something, just put pen to paper, or start typing on a keyboard, or just build something. Nothing will ever come, right? So we strongly encourage action. That is one of the most important. Now, the Idea Lab itself contains, at the moment, 6 pathways, or 6 what we call pathways. These are essentially, at a high level, they're programs that are designed to move people from the old world into the new world. I could go into a lot of detail about each one of these different pathways, but instead today what I really want to talk about are one of the programs that we run called the Health Data Initiative, because I think that's obviously very relevant for the topic at hand today. So if we have time at the end and you guys have some questions about what these pathways are, we should feel free to ask, because I'd love to actually talk about some of those. So just keep this slide in mind. So let's start off with a couple of stories. These are 2 guys based out of New York. Their names are Mike Galbo and Russ Green. And Mike and Russ's story was kind of a cool one. They both had a very similar experience, separately, very similar, where they had a loved one, a family member, go into a hospital for an outpatient procedure, who, in each case, required post-acute care, rehab therapy, whatever, after they were discharged from the hospital. On discharge, both Mike and Russ were presented with a piece of paper that, photocopied piece of paper, photocopied 1,000 times, that basically contained a list of all of the post-acute care facilities in the area, their phone numbers, and their addresses. So Mike and Russ did what any rational individual would do at that moment, which is to say they picked the one that's geographically closest to their house, right? Grandma's in a post-acute care facility, I want to go visit grandma. It's easier if grandma's 5 minutes away than 30 minutes. Now it turned out that in both cases, these were bad decisions. Both of those facilities had issues with things like over-medication, other things. And thankfully, nobody was seriously hurt, but as a result, they did not have the best experience. Now what's interesting is that Mike and Russ actually started talking, and they realized that there was data out there, actually data that we released, that spoke to the quality of these facilities, as opposed to the actual facilities, as opposed to just the basic, sort of demographic details, or geographic details of where they were located. So they started a company called AIDIT, and the goal of AIDIT is to basically take all this data that's out there that talks about post-acute care facilities and their quality metrics, and make that available to both caregivers and discharge planners, so people can start to make better decisions about where they send their life. And if you think about it, it's really interesting, because if they get some traction, all of a sudden the post-acute care industry completely disrupts, right? Because instead of these facilities competing on geography, all of a sudden now they have to compete on metrics that matter, which means that theoretically, once some will get better, the ones that don't get better will go out of business, right? And so now there's a new paradigm for post-acute care, and these guys made it happen, or are in the process of making it happen. Another 2 guys. These are actually fellow graduates from the University of Chicago's computer science program, Joe Flash and Declan Fry. And when they graduated, they were working for a few years in Chicago as just a web consulting shop. They would do jobs for companies that needed websites set up, apps built, that kind of thing. And then one day, in 2012, they were contacted by a small nonprofit to help create an application to organize all of the community services that this organization provided to the community. It just wasn't very organized. They wanted something that could help people actually find services and access them in appropriate ways. Now this world, the world of social services, I don't know if any of you guys are part of that, but it is incredibly fragmented. There's no standards, there's no sort of official mechanism by which you can discover new things. It's really a shame, because this is obviously one of the areas where some of the neediest people in our country could actually benefit from this stuff. And so Joe and Declan realized as they were building this that there was a huge opportunity here to actually do something meaningful and helpful. And so they created a company called Purple Binder. which I love. They called it purple binder because when they were going around to all the social workers and community caseworkers, it turned out that everybody had massive purple binders on their desks, like Post-it notes stuck in the pages to remind them about where things were, right? So this is a nod to the sort of old world, which I find kind of interesting. And so they built this organization called Purple Binder. Again, it uses a lot of open data that we and others provide, and starts to organize this world around social services. And make it easier for people who are trying to get help to people and people who are trying to find help, to actually find the right services for them. One more. This is Josh Kushner, Mario Schlosser, and Kevin Mizani. So Josh and Mario, actually back in the day, not too long ago, a couple years ago, were running this very successful social gaming. And Josh, one day Josh, he's also a VC, runs a VC company called Drive Capital. He was sitting around looking at an explanation of benefits document from his insurance company and thought, I have no idea what this is, right? How many times have we all had that thought? And so he realized it made no sense at all. And he started talking to Mario and Kevin about it. And they thought, you know, there's something here, like we can build something that that could help people understand their benefits and maybe think about an app or a service or something like that. Mario, sort of listening to all of this after a lot of conversation, pipes up and says, we should just start an insurance company. That's what they did. They started an insurance company. Think about this, right? You've got Blue Cross Blue Shield, you've got Aetna, you've got United. I mean, these are big, big, big organizations. You got three guys who know nothing about insurance, and they're like, you know what, we can do it better. And I will tell you right now, I mean, I'm going to make a prediction. I'm just going to say, these guys are going to change the world. These three guys and their company are going to fundamentally change the world, because what they are building is not a health insurance company. They're building a healthcare company with an insurance company as sort of the front end of it, right? And the way that they're approaching this, using data to drive their decisions, basically upending all of the rules that any insurance company executive will tell you is the wrong thing to do. They're doing exactly the opposite because they've realized that there's so many different things that can be done that we're just not doing, that they will change the world. So mark my words, they will do it. Now here's the best part. Before starting any of these companies, Mike and Russ and Joe and Declan and Mario and Josh and Kevin, they weren't healthcare, right? They knew very, very little about healthcare and the healthcare industry. And this is a trend that I've been fascinated by for a long time. Look at people like David Friedberg, the Climate Corporation, Jeff Bezos, Amazon, Nicholas Enstrom, and Dennis Bruce from Skype. Like, these guys were not retailers. They were not telecommunications people. They were certainly not weather insurance people. Yet they all created things that fundamentally disrupted these industries, right? And the fact that it's happening in health and human services, right? Healthcare in this country is a $2.8 trillion industry, 18% of our GDP, and it's only going up. This fact is nothing but encouraging. We need people who know nothing about this stuff to jump in and say that things are possible that everybody else says are impossible, and then just go and do it, right? And this is what gets me fired up. When I see people like this, who are just like, yeah, let's take the big idea and run with it. Let's do it. And so we're looking for these people constantly. My role, in a lot of ways, is to help find people both inside and out, kind of lift them up and help them to do this. And we really believe that, again, this type of disruption is fundamentally necessary because of this statistic. And what I find interesting is that it's not only necessary, we're at the right moment in history, because as you guys all know, healthcare is undergoing the most transformative change since the creation of Medicare and Medicaid in 1965, right now. So, for the past 3 years, the state of healthcare has really been in a dramatic sort of state of, right? It's all been set in motion by this thing called the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare. We're not living anymore in a system where more than 20% of your administrative costs go to, or 20% of your insurance premiums go to administrative costs rather than direct care, right? We're not living in a health system anymore where preventative care is not a fundamental part of the insurance plan. And we're not now living in a world where it's impossible to shop for high-quality health insurance without fear of being turned down or pre-existing conditions or other things, right? These things are all true. What is interesting to me is that data is driving at a large part of this, right? Data is the fundamental common denominator behind almost all of these changes. It's changing how we interact with healthcare, it's changing how we experience our healthcare, and it's changing how we manage our healthcare. It's fueling changes like payment reform, right? As you guys heard a little bit last night, and I think are probably well aware, we're moving away, we have to move away from a system where healthcare is transactional, where we go in and we pay for things to be done to us, as opposed to a system where we pay to stay out of, we pay to stay out of the hospital, right? We want to move to a value-based care system where we are doctors and others in the system are compensated to keep us healthy, as opposed to treating us when we're sick. Data fuels it. Data really changes how the average American interacts with their own healthcare. How many people here have a device like a Fitbit or a Fuel Band or something? A few of you? So I've seen just personally, I've been carrying a Fitbit around for a few years now, and I've actually seen a specific effect that watching data can actually have on your health and your well-being, right? And these things are only going to start to accelerate. And one of the problems we have right now with this is that we're generating a ton of data. We're not doing a good job of analyzing that data and using that analysis to be actionable. But that's next. That's what's coming. We're just at the tip of the iceberg. Data is also changing how physicians provide care. Right? A lot of this stuff, blood glucose data, blood pressure data, weight data, these things are all starting to get integrated into real-time systems where physicians can be alerted for anomalies and actually send somebody out or make a phone call to make sure that everything's going okay. This is a big part of the aging in place stuff, right? And a huge component of aging in place is getting the right data to the right person at the right time. And as you saw just with the purple binder example, data is changing how we provide social service. One other great story about this, there was a team in one of our programs called HHS Ignite from the Administration for Children and Families. And I love this story. They basically, state-based child welfare programs are required to report on a monthly or quarterly basis statistics up to the Administration for Children and Families to tell them how their programs are going, because we fund a lot of those programs. So for years, maybe decades, we've been taking that data and compiling it into a Word document, right? So it's like a 40-page Word document. It doesn't even have like embedded Excel tables. It's just got like Word tables, right? With just like charts and lots of words, and it's really, honestly, completely useless to actually manage a program. And so this team at ACF said, we've got all this data, and we've got all these tools that are available right now and cheap and they're pretty easy to use. Why can't we do something better? And so in just a few months, with basically no money, they went out and got Tableau. They taught themselves how to use it, and they built a gorgeous, interactive, incredibly valuable dashboard that allows state-based child welfare programs for the first time to really manage their programs based on data. Look at trends, compare themselves to other states, look at where they're doing badly in counties, drill into those counties, figure out what the demographic breakdown is, why things are going wrong. But they built something using data that is saving children's lives, right? I mean, to me, there's nothing better. It's awesome. So, I think it's clear we believe that data is the future of healthcare, right? So the question is, what are we doing about it at the department? This is something that we strongly believe in. Okay, great. How do we move this ball forward? So this is where the Health Data Initiative comes into play. For the last 4 years, we've really made the priority, we made the idea of releasing data a priority at the department. And under this initiative, there really is kind of three main things. First, the idea to make health data as openly available as possible. Number two, to disseminate that data as broadly across the ecosystem as we can. We want people to use it. We don't want to just put it out there and say, have fun, right? And to that point, we need to continuously educate people. When I first got to HHS, one of the guys on my team was kind of walking me through our website, healthdata.gov, and pointing out some interesting data sets. And he pointed out this one called the National Plan Provider Enumeration System. And he said, this is a great data set. It's incredibly useful. And I read the first sentence of that data set. I don't have it here, so I can't repeat it verbatim, but it made literally no sense. I mean, none whatsoever. And so I read it and I looked at it and I was like, I don't know, maybe I'm stupid, but I don't understand what this means at all. And he looked up at me and said, oh, well, it's just a list of all the doctors in the country for the most part, their specialties and where they are. I was like, oh, well, that's a useful data set. Why don't we just say that? And so part of the education process is both fixing our materials and trying to make our things more accessible to people who can do things with them without an advanced degree in public health. But also part of it is leveraging tools that others have built and helping other people use those tools. So the first step, obviously, is making the data that we have available for public use. Now, for the last 4 years, as many of you know, or some of you probably know, we've put a lot of energy into this idea of data liberation. We started with quite literally 30 data sets 4 years ago. It was 45 people in a room and 30 data sets and a file on the table. We said, come back in 90 days and show us what you can do. 90 days later, 24 applications have been built off of those data sets that had never existed before, which is amazing when you think about it. Today, we have over 1,400 data sets cataloged on healthdata.gov, some of which obviously are more useful than others, but all of which are actually getting used in some way, shape, or form, both internally and externally. There are more private sector organizations that are using this data than ever before. I constantly am looking for examples because I like talking about, as you saw, some of the people that are doing really interesting things with this stuff. And every time I go out and talk to people, I get another example of, oh, hey, we're using this data set to do X, Y, and Z. And it's a new use. It's something that we never would have thought of, but it could fundamentally, these uses could fundamentally change the game. And so I think the thing that I can report is that at this time, we've really successfully changed this idea of data being, the existence of data with an HHS from this idea of closed, we don't want to give it out or give it to anybody, to open. Sure, there's still some recalcitrant holdouts, but for the most part, everybody at HHS understands why we're doing it and why it's necessary and what the value is because they've seen tangible evidence of it. I'll give you a good example. Last year, you guys might remember that CMS released a big data set for the first time. It was cost data for the 100 most common inpatient and outpatient procedures. And we got a huge response on the release of this data. It was like really the first time that CMS had ever done something like this. The data set was downloaded a couple 100,000 times in just the first couple of weeks. And actually, one of my favorite things was that it was actually featured on the Daily Show. But not only was it featured on the Daily Show, it was featured positively on the Daily Show. Jon Stewart's smiling, and that's not an ironic smile. It's like a real smile. Go back and watch the clip. He talks about how awesome government is. You never hear Jon Stewart talk about how awesome government is. But maybe even better than that was, I was talking to my direct boss, who's the deputy secretary for the department, a few days later, and I was telling him about some of the download statistics and how we saw people were using the data. And he looked at me and he said, hey, Bryan, that's great, really great. But what are we doing next? And I thought, man, that's exactly the kind of challenge I need, right? Because it wasn't just the standard, okay, we did something good, let's talk about it a lot, rest on our laurels, and cruise for a while. It was to keep going, right? So we're really never ones to pass up that opportunity. So we said, all right, let's figure out what's next. And what came next was for us to define what I call an execution plan for this idea of the health data industry. I don't like strategic plans because they tend to be things that people write, put on the shelf, and pick up 5 years later to rewrite. Nobody looks at it and continuing. Execution plans, on the other hand, contain very specific initiatives that are time-bound and measurable, and that we're actually going to do stuff. So the execution plan here has 5 goals, each of which is time-bound and measurable, each of which has initiatives underneath it that are time-bound and measurable. You can go to our website and look it up and check on our progress. Number 1, we want to make healthdata.gov our sort of flagship data website more user-friendly, more user-centric, more useful as a discovery collaboration platform. Number 2, we want to focus on this idea of strategic data liberation. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Number 3, we really want to build a true community of data users. We've got people like Fred Trotter sitting here. Like Fred Trotter is the central organizing principle of a community of data users, and we want to build a group of people around him that all use this data and do interesting things. You can build a community. It's much, much harder to take something away, right? And we can use that community power to actually keep escalating this idea of getting data out there and getting data used. We want to also continue to incentivize this ecosystem to use data in new and exciting ways. So maybe that means more prize and challenge. Maybe that means more more assistance in forging partnerships between entities that could actually work together to do things. So there's a lot of different ways we could go. And then finally, we want to use our office to help implement policies and sort of regulations within the department itself that foster this idea of openness and transparency and data sharing. Because, I mean, let's be honest, once we're gone, we're gone. And what we haven't codified, it's going to be a lot harder to actually keep those things. So we're trying to codify as much as possible in the next couple of years. So we're always looking for more data. This is sort of a big theme of ours, obviously. One of the things that we've really focused a lot on, I think, over the last few years is this idea of entrepreneurs and developers getting access to data, doing interesting things with it. But it's not just entrepreneurs and developers that want more data. It's actually people, too. And that's where something like Blue Button comes into play. How many people here know about Blue Button? Yeah. All right. For those of you who don't, Blue Button is, well, it's a blue button. Literally, a blue button on the website. The idea behind Blue Button is that if you click this blue button, you will get a copy of your patient record from whatever organization it is that supports it. So if it's a pharmacy, you might get your prescription history. If it's your doctor, you might get your EMR records. We're on version 2 now, and version 2 basically takes this idea and says we should be able to provide this data in a structured format, a repeatable structured format. We should be able to transport the data securely between different parties. And you should be able to request it on a regular basis if you want. That's what Blue Button Plus does. And it's cool because a lot of organizations are right now in the process of implementing Blue Button Plus. We're trying to work with Medicare to, they have the first version of Blue Button on their website. It's not really all that useful. It just spits out an ASCII document, which you can parse, but it's a pain in the butt. It changes a lot, it breaks a lot. So what we're trying to get them, we're trying to help them work to Blue Button Plus, which would allow for essentially, OAuth type authentication to the system, structured, a very structured file that can be repeatedly and easily parsed, and a mechanism to actually click the blue button to not just download a view, but to transmit it to a third party that might be able to do something interesting with it. There's a lot of things supporting this, right? HIPAA regs were just changed. It gave patients an absolute right to their data in an electronic form. This is a new thing. And then meaningful use stage 2 is a lot of what it's about is trying to make data flow that's consistent. So Blue Button is a big part of that as well. A lot of people ask me about use cases for Blue Button. I mean, I think the use cases are innumerable, and there are thousands of them that I haven't even begun to think about yet. But I'll give you a couple of really simple ones. How many of you here have kids? Okay. How many of you with kids have ever had to do the incredibly annoying dance of going to your physician, getting vaccination records either delivered to you, like delivered to you, or faxed to you, and then you had to go to a school or a camp and hand it over to the right? This is a huge pain in the ass. Imagine if we could solve that for everybody in the country using Blue Button. We've just like freed up so much time. Like that's a massive productivity effort right there, and I think it's something that, like, literally, it's one simple use case, right? Another one. Go back to the explanation of benefits, right? Explanation of benefits makes no sense. I mean, my dad's a doc, and he's an OB/GYN, and I showed him the EOBs from my second child's birth, and he was like, I have no idea. And if he doesn't know what it means, like, how am I supposed to know what it means? So imagine, using Blue Button to basically transmit EOBs securely to a third party that does nothing but translate them for you. Oh, and then, by the way, spot the services that are wrong. It shouldn't have been charged, right? Because, look, so when I got the bills from my second kid birth, there was a C-section, and the bills for literally everybody in the hospital. And, it wasn't that much. The insurance covered quite a bit of it. It was about maybe $800 that I had to pay. But I went through and called all these people, and I eventually only ended up paying $200, right? Because there were that many things that were incorrect. And if that's just it's crazy what we're doing. And you can imagine Blue Button, a good implementation of an app that leverages Blue Button across the board could actually help solve that problem for a lot of people. So the other thing I should mention also is that ONC, the Office of the National Coordinator for Health IT within HHS, is doing a lot to try to make Blue Button useful. They actually just launched a website, which you guys should go check out. It's called the Blue Button Connector. So it's bluebuttonconnector.healthit.gov. And the idea behind the Blue Button Connector is that you type in your provider, you type in actually anybody in the ecosystem, and see exactly what data they provide and what formats they provide. And so you can kind of use that to, if you want, to help convince your provider to move it along a little, right? Or you can change where you shop, where you go, because you believe in the idea of accessing direct authority. So it's a valuable resource. It's brand new, so it's still getting populated, but it's also actually accepting user populations. So if you know something that's either incorrect or that should be in there, you can suggest action. And then the other thing I would say is that if you or anybody you know are already using Blue Button, let us know, because we're always looking for examples. I want to tell more stories, because the way that Blue Button continues to get adopted is by us and everybody else talking about all the goodness that comes of this data. So I talked a little bit before about how the default setting has gone from closed to open. And I would say that almost every organization at HHS is really getting into the tag. I don't have time to talk about all of them, but I'll focus on a couple. Start with the big one, CMS. So I think in general it's very safe to say that CMS as an organization has been making their data much, much more available over the last couple of years than ever before. Started with the hospital charge data. Recently, just last week, basically, maybe the week before, we released the Medicare provider utilization data. This in and of itself is kind of a massive feat. We were prevented for 30 years by an injunction in a Florida court from a lawsuit brought by the American Medical Association from releasing this data. Strange, right? Until you realize that the American Medical Association represents a bunch of doctors who probably don't want their incomes and why they charge, how much they charge to be public record. But that should tell you something about why the data is important, right? Fred, I think probably later is going to talk about some of the stuff that he's done, particularly with this data, but it's been out there for, what, a week and a half, and I am eagerly awaiting some of the really cool things that will come out of this. There's some basic things. You can go to the New York Times website and do a very simple doctor lookup. You can go to CMS's website and do a very simple doctor lookup. Fred's got some really cool stuff cooking. There's a bunch of people out there that I've talked to that are doing great things. This is something, obviously, that's going to be used in this Codathon today. So I'm actually really curious to see if there can be something out of here. I want to write blog posts about on the government website about all of the cool stuff that comes out of it. So again, if you guys know of anything, if you come across a visualization, if you talk to some of the kids that are in their coding, they're doing interesting stuff with it, tell me so I can publicize it to get the word out there. What else? Last year, CMS released this thing called a data enclave, a virtual research data center. Before the VRDC existed, the way that you got data from CMS was you went through this organization called ResDAC. ResDAC evaluated a research proposal, passed it along to CMS, who passed it through the data governance board, who evaluated the research request again, decided whether or not it was worthwhile. If they decided it was worthwhile, they cut your data for you and ship you an encrypted hard drive that you could then use to run your research report. But if you wanted to do anything else with the data, you actually had to destroy the hard drive, put a new research request in for ResDAC, the same data set, pay a lot of money again to recover data and get that new encrypted hard drive sent back to you. What the VRDC does, it says, you know what, that's silly. We still want you to go through the process of evaluating the research request because, let's be honest, we don't want pharmaceutical companies using Medicare claims data to market to Medicare companies, right? We want the data to be used responsibly. So you still have to go through a process of getting your research request validated. But now instead of getting a hard drive shipped to you, you can actually pay a much smaller amount of money and get a login to a secure computing facility, an infrastructure that allows you to both use tools that exist there and bring your own tools in to do the analysis that you do. That's a game changer, right? Because it all of a sudden lowers the cost of entry, lowers the barrier of entry for people who want to do research on Medicare data, which, by the way, is an incredibly valuable data source, especially when you combine it with it. So this is really just getting started, but it's a very, very, very interesting. It's a very interesting thing to do. So keep an eye on what CMS is doing. The doctor utilization data set is not the last of it. There's a lot more to come. Literally a couple of weeks from now, there'll be more. And we're going to keep pushing this train as hard and as fast as we can. So if there are different data sets that you guys think would be interesting to release, tell us. We'll see what we can do because we want to put them out there. FDA is another good example. There's a project going on right now called Open FDA. So the general idea of this is that the FDA currently has a ton of data that actually is very useful. Adverse event data, so even something with there's an adverse reaction to a drug or something happens, they get data about that. Recall data, so that head of lettuce that was sitting in the Safeway has E. coli on it, like that gets captured by the FDA. Product labeling data, so what the label is on the drug, all of that kind of stuff. These are all data sets that actually exist publicly today. But what OpenFDA is doing is actually putting those data sets into a API format so that developers can actually use them in machine readable and embeddable ways. Now, okay, maybe that's not such a big deal, but think about this. Let's go back to that head of lettuce being recalled, right? Imagine an app. And imagine an app, say, using IP technology, right? So you walk by the lettuce in the grocery store and you reach in to pick up that head of lettuce, and all of a sudden your phone buzzes. And it says, don't pick up that head of lettuce because it's been recalled, right? That's not possible today, but with this, that scenario is completely possible. Somebody should do that. Build that app. Think about how cool that would be, right? And by the way, those kind of problems happen all the time. This is not rare. Food recalls happen all the time. So that's just one example of what FDA is doing. NIH, I mean, they do all kinds of crazy stuff. And have been a leader, I think, in this idea of open data for a long time, with Snowman and a whole bunch of other things. But one of the things that they do that I think are really interesting is they were the first at HHS to implement a really robust public access policy. Basically, they said, and this is a couple of years ago, they said, if you get money from NIH to do research, your research must be published in the public domain and the data behind it within 12 months after publication. The journals hated it, right, because that's sort of the way they make money. But NIH said, look, we're doing this in the public good, and if you want this to be in the public good, your data's got to be available. So what's really cool is that we're now expanding NIH's public access policies to every entity across the department that funds research over a certain amount. And we're going to try to leverage the exact same mechanism that NIH does, so we don't build like a whole bunch of other public access libraries and databases. We just want to use one. And so we're working on doing this right now. They're also working on something called BD2K, Big Data Technology. I also don't really love the term big data. It's one of those phrases that has been overused recently. It doesn't really mean a whole lot anymore. But you know, NIH as an organization has a lot of data, right? Genomics, proteomics, biomics. I mean, like anything and everything you can imagine has to do with what's inside you, they've got data on. And these are massive data sets. So they're actually undertaking a decade-long effort right now, putting a bunch of money into a program to actually help define how they can use this data in much ways. It turns out that if you want to do interesting things with it, you've actually got to embed some stuff. So you guys probably heard about the Brain initiative that got picked up. We don't have the technology today to be able to take the amount of data that you can store into your head and put it onto a system. You just don't have it. Especially if you want to access it in an ad hoc and rapid. And so part of it is, how do we invent these technologies? This is really like basic research stuff. Really, really interesting to see what happens. Now, I told you I mentioned strategically relevant data assets before. So this is actually pretty simple. The department, just a couple of months ago, released their version of their strategic plan for 2014 to 2018. One of the nice things about this one is that it is actually goal-oriented and pretty actionable. There are only 21 goals in this one instead of the 130 that were in the strategic plan before this. I believe that if you have 130 strategic goals, you have 0 strategic goals. And so we actually have narrowed it down in a reasonable way now. And what we're going to be doing, what this means is that we're going to be looking for data sets both inside and outside HHS that we haven't released yet, that haven't been cataloged yet, that have a have the opportunity to potentially impact some of these strategic goals. We want to focus the data on the things we're trying to do. At the same time, there are data sets out there that do impact the things that we're trying to do and are already out there. We want to push the pedal down on those also, and really drive towards a common goal. That's what strategic goals are all about. We want to basically stop doing this sort of scattershot, okay, all of the data, liberate all of the data, and really focus it on things that are strategic. There's another element of strategic data too, which is what people need, right? So if you say to me, I really need this data because I'm going to use it to do X, Y, and Z, okay, that could be a strategically relevant data asset as well. So that's really how we're focusing that. We're also looking outside of HHS. We want to bring state data into the system. So we've got 9 states that have data already in there. We've got a bunch in the pipeline. Louisiana is not, unfortunately, in either of those categories. So if there's anybody in the room who could potentially help us bring Louisiana state data, we're not bringing it into the system, don't worry, we're not taking the data. What we're doing is just cataloging it. We want it to be, all of this data accessible in one place, or at least linked to one. I would encourage Louisiana to join the party and have some fun. We can help with it. We've helped all of these states in green do it, so we can definitely add you guys as well. Now, also speaking about looking outside the walls of HHS, and I hope Ramesh will forgive me for what I'm about to do, we're looking for people. That's our lucky, that's our ideal out dog. He's great at ever end. Actually, it's funny, he's not technically allowed to be in the building, but he figured out a way to get him in the building. I'm sure I will tell him now. We're looking for 3 people right now, or 3-ish people right now. So we're looking for what we're calling a data entrepreneur. This is somebody who can help do all of the things that I talked about with the Health Data Initiative, but we see this person as like being a hybrid, like sort of inside HHS and outside HHS, being an evangelist across the country, finding the examples of people who are using data in interesting ways, helping internally to both convince people that putting data out there is the right thing to do. It's a really cool job for the right person. And so I encourage you guys to take a look or point other people at it if you're interested. We're also looking for a new innovator in residence. This is one of our pathways. Our current innovator in residence is sponsored by the West Health Foundation. The new one is sponsored by KIMS, and is going to be working on a topic of patient match. So patient match is really interesting. You would think that in order to have an effective, interoperable healthcare system in the United States, it would be helpful to know which John Smith you were talking about when you get around, right? It also turns out that the Department of Health and Human Services is prevented by congressional law from investing a single dollar in research that can help us create a national patient ID. Right? Whole bunch of reasons for that, none of which I find to be very compelling. But luckily, there's this idea of patient match, which we can think about leveraging technology and data to figure out how to figure out if this John Smith is the same as that John Smith without giving John Smith national patient. So that's what this innovator in residence is going to do. Help us figure out how to actually make that a reality. Build on a lot of the work that's already being done, but let's actually do it. And then finally, we have a new round of HHS entrepreneurs that's opening up in May. We are on the verge of selecting the projects that are going to be part of this. General idea behind this pathway is that departments or divisions across HHS will essentially sponsor what they consider to be some really, really, really important projects that they don't have the skill set to work on inside. And then we recruit people to come in for a year, with the idea being that you're only there for a year. And the reason that that's important is that if you're only there for a year, you have to do it, right? If you want to know more about this, talk to Zach, Gio, and Chris Lunt, who are sitting in the audience. They were part of the first round, and definitely had to do things differently to get their stuff going on. It's been incredibly successful so far. We're in our second round right now. The projects for the third round are really, really cool. I can't tell you what they are yet, but they're really cool. And we're going to be accepting applications for those positions in May for a position to start in November of next year. So keep this in mind. It's really, really interesting. Let's see, what else? I would be remiss if I did not invite you to be sleeping. So please come to Health Data Palooza 5. Last year was amazing. There were 2,000 people in the audience. Basically, anybody and everybody in this world that you care to talk to. The keynotes were incredibly interesting. The panels were fascinating. We had a lot of fun. And I've got just a ton of stories about businesses that were launched, deals that were struck, and people meeting people that actually went on to do great things. So it's an incredible event. So this year in DC, we're expecting about 2,500 people from June 1st through the 3rd. And I don't expect it to be any different from what it was last year, so I encourage everybody to come. Oh, and then sort of alongside this, I talked about the Medicare provider utilization data set, the one that today. We're actually running a Codapalooza, but it actually kind of started already. So we're giving away 35,000 prizes. Go to the healthdatapalooza.org website if you want to try to earn some money and fame and fortune. We're going to announce basically the finalists. The finalists are going to present at the Day of Palooza, and then there'll be a public judgment. It'll be a lot of fun. And somebody will walk away with a lot of money and notoriety. So if you're interested in something like this, take a look at the challenge, because we really want people to do fascinating things with this data set. Okay, I've been talking for a while. Let me recap the major asks here. Code Palooza, start coding, participate. Number 2, join our team, start our mesh. Promise I won't take anybody away for too long. Number 3, give us your data. If you have data, state of Louisiana, that you want to share, we want to help you share it and get it used. Number 4, help us identify data assets that you think are interesting that we have not released yet. So if you think we have something, tell us. We will help you get it. Tell us about your stuff. If you're using Blue Button, if you've developed a really cool application or service that you think needs to be talked about, and put it in the community, let us know. And then finally, come to Health Data Palooza. Now, just one last thing. I think that we really are, when I look at this stuff, I really do believe that we're sitting on the edge of an incredibly pivotal moment in history when it comes to public health and healthcare and the delivery of human services. And, everything in the world is changing, right? It has to. The costs of healthcare in this country, just as the example, are unsustainable. We cannot afford to keep doing things that we're doing. Payment models are changing, data availability is changing, treatments are changing, the actual fundamental culture of this world is changing. And what kind of fascinates me is that every single person, not just in this room, but in this country, actually has the potential to be part of this change. Everybody's a patient at the lowest common denominator. And so you can sit on the sidelines and you can kind of accept the status quo, right? You can keep doing things the way that they've been doing. Or you can decide that you're going to be a part of this change, right? And it doesn't necessarily mean writing code. Maybe it just means becoming a more informed, engaged patient, right? Maybe it means convincing your kid's pediatrician to actually get an electronic system because it's important for you and for him to have electronic records. You can do a lot of things, right? And so my final ask, there's no better time to do this. And it can't be done just by government. It can't be done just by a few entrepreneurs. We need your help. We need you to help us disrupt the healthcare ecosystem. Thank you very much. I'm happy to answer questions if there's time.
Yep, there is. We've got about 5 to 10 minutes for Q&A. So, and Mike, there is no remote mic up here, and that doesn't come off from walking in. So, are they underneath?
You can yell at me. I'm going to repeat questions.
Do we have any questions for Bryan this morning? Of course, absolutely.
So what date is coming out next?
I can't tell you.
Off the record, what date is coming out next?
It's not off the record when I have a microphone and a microphone. But trust me, you'll like it. It's a surprise, man. Now, the other thing I will say, if there's data that you want us to release, which I know there is, tell us. Maybe that helps prioritize what we're doing.
Thanks, Brian. Appreciate all of that. Appreciate that.
I'm Robert Tucci, professor at SLCC. Just a question about data categorization. It seems like all of those industries and all of those companies that were broken out into the sub picture that you drew earlier, that's a lot of data categorization for one major industry to handle. I think I see why you're doing what you're doing and the problems that are presented by it. Is that the main problem, really? Is just all of those different little agencies in those circles breaking out, having all this data that has to be sort of kept in each area? I mean, are we going to a model that is just a centralized model and you're trying to help us get access to it? Or is it actually turning more discrete? Where are we headed with that?
So what I would say is that the main goal is for the useful data to be useful, right? But the first step in that is just making it open and available, right? Until healthdata.gov was launched, nobody had any idea really what data sets were out there, what they think about asking about. There was no idea of standard APIs or immutable ways of getting access to that information. So there's a foundational layer that we had to build in order to make that possible. The other thing that we're really trying to do is to get programs themselves to use the data that we generate to help make the program. There isn't a whole lot of like internal data use. So that's another use case. I think now we're at the point where we have a mechanism by which we can collect or catalog, I should say, the data and point people from a single location to the right place to actually get access to information. So now the main thing to do, I think, in addition to continuing that on that path, is to really help people understand how data gets used and how they can then use data to do it. We want to be able to answer questions. I would love to be able to connect somebody with an expert when they have questions about what this column actually means, or how is it collected, or what are the issues with the data that's collected. Those are all important questions. If we can make those connections, I think, as the next step, that will help to advance the ecosystem.
Got one back here, Bryan.
Yeah.
Bryan, can you clarify for me the difference or similarities between what you've talked about today with the release of data and what's happening with the qualified entity certification?
So QEs, the qualified entity were defined by section 10332 of the Affordable Care Act. The idea is that a qualified entity is an organization that has access to claims data in addition to Medicare claims data, and wants to use that data in conjunction with Medicare claims data to do some kind of interesting analysis around providers in that geographic area. I don't know the specific numbers right now. In the first year, I know that we approved something like 4 QEs and they got data. And I think we should be seeing actually the first reports from those guys any day now. And I know that some QEs have also been approved after that. But I don't know I don't have the details about when those reports will be approved. Hopefully, but that's the difference. It's like a very specific section of the Affordable Care Act that creates a way that entities could access data that they couldn't.
Got one more here.
Yeah.
Bryan, my question relates to your one of your bullet points about help us find relevant data. And so are you thinking that that problem is connected with your cataloging of various data sets, and what are you doing in cataloging? A number of years ago, I worked on a project called meta searching, and the goal is that, by with a lot of different data sets, and then you ask me a question, each of those data sets is likely to give a nice answer, or relatively good answer for that question. So I'm just wondering how you're thinking in terms of help us find relevant data.
So I think there are a couple answers. One, and I'll again use Fred as an example. Fred has a decent idea, if not a great idea, of what types of data that we have at HHS and where that data might be located. And so Fred can say, you know what, here's a data set that I think would be really useful for some work, and it doesn't really exist today, and it would be great if it did. So actually, the first data set that Fred ever requested by an employer was this idea of doctor referrals, right? And the data could be made public because it didn't exist. So Fred actually asked us to with it. It did. So that's one way, right? Another way is by talking to people inside the department that work in areas that you're interested in, saying, do you have anything that kind of fits within these criteria? And that's one area that we can help with, right? We can be that conduit between the outside world and the inside world to try to help figure out if this information exists. Right? If so, where it is, how it can be used, can it be used, and all of that. I would say those are the two major pathways, but they're probably more.
I'd like to thank Bryan for coming on in today and speaking to us. Really appreciate your effort, Bryan. Thank you so much.
Thank you guys very much.
All right, with that, we're going to take a few-minute break, and we're going to come back. Secretary Colbert from the Louisiana Department of Health and Hospitals is going to be here to speak, along with Esri GIS. So 15 minutes, and come on back in.